In this video, I'm going to talk about DA sanders. And there's a regular DA sander, and then you got a finish sander. And although they do work similar, there's little differences between the two. And like any tools, they're both kind of fitted for their own different jobs. So let's get into it. All right, what exactly does DA mean? DA stands for dual action. The pad will rotate on these sanders, and also they'll kind of oscillate. It's got another part behind the pad here, and it's an off center, so at the same time that the pad is spinning, it's actually oscillating around. So that's the dual action part of it. That's what DA means. And this DA is made by National Detroit. Okay, also with the dual action sander, it has this locking feature in here, and you can slide this in, and that'll lock that pad in so it doesn't oscillate. It'll spin almost like a grinder. Let me take this pad off to be able to see a little easier. The pad will screw into this part right here, and that spins around. So that'll actually spin both ways. And then this main head, you can see how it's off center where the pad goes in. So that's the oscillating feature on this. And actually this piece here that slides, line that tang up with the hole in there, push it in, and now when it spins, it doesn't let this spin, so it's more like a grinder. It'll just run in one direction. You can put 80 grit sandpaper on your pad, and you can actually almost use this like a grinder. You can cut off paint and primer pretty quick. There's one other feature in these DAs, and I never knew about it. I kind of stumbled across it at one time. What I was doing is going to change this bearing in here. There's a bearing that this rides in, and that probably lasts, I'm going to say, about 10 years, because this DA, it's about 45 years old. I bought it new, and I think I've probably put 4 of those bearings in, and it's kind of common. You'll start hearing them howling. When I was taking it apart to work on it, I noticed, I don't know if it's going to show up or not, it's actually got a wobble to it. So this thing, when it spins, it'll go back and forth. It's almost like this shaft is bent. And I thought, I wonder if I dropped that thing at one time and bent it. So when I called the company to order this new bearing, I asked them about that. I said, why does this thing have a wobble to it? And I was told that's the way they're designed. It's been so long ago, I don't remember what the purpose of it was. Let me put this pad back on here. But I'm going to spin this pad, and you'll actually see it kind of wobbling. But I did figure out how it does it. The shaft coming through the motor is straight. When they put the bore in this bottom piece here, or it's got a little bit of an angle to it, and this finish sander, this is a Dynabrade. This has the dual action, but there is no wobble to it, and it has a little bit different pattern than a DA. It's a little bit tighter pattern, and I'm going to show how the pattern works in a little bit. These run a little bit smoother. They're a little easier to control. They're used about for the same purpose. This just gives a little bit smoother finish, a little finer finish, and it's just easier to run. And what I think is one of the most important things on either one of these sanders is the pad you're using. These are both 3M pads on here. They're almost like a real thick sponge. They've got some give to them, but they're still fairly solid. When I bought this Dynabrade, I still got the pad sitting around for that. It's thin, and it's a pretty dense pad, and I like something with a little more give to it. I didn't really care for this, so I changed it out with this here. And you can see this one, I think the finish sander is a little bit more spongier than on a DA. You need something that's going to help float over everything. And there's debates on whether you can block sand with the DA or not. And you absolutely can, as long as you know how to run it. I think DA's got a bad name from years ago, and you old timers out there, you'll remember this, but back in the 60s and the 70s, the paint on cars, that lacquer, especially GM, that stuff was so hard to sand, you couldn't really feather anything out like you can today. If you had a chip or a scratch or a gouge you had to sand out, you had to sit there and work on it. And what would happen, they'd take their DA and they'd use the edge of the pad, and they're trying to get through the layers of paint to get to that bottom of that chip or scratch or whatever it was. And that paint was so tough, all it would do is just gum up your paper. It would just load up the paper. You couldn't just hold it flat and keep working over it. You'd never get through there. You'd go through tons and tons of paper. You'd prime it and block it, and you thought it was filled, but it would always leave that little, what we call them, bullseyes. And that's why I think it got the reputation you can't block sand with them. But today's paint, that stuff is soft. You can float it over there. You can definitely use a DA to block sand. Talking about years ago, the old paint and stuff. When I started out, the couple shops I worked in, everybody was using 5-inch paper, and I still got a couple boxes of this stuff laying around. Pads back then we used on a DA, they were harder than this, and you had a tube of glue. You'd put the glue on your pad, take the paper, you'd smear it around. What would happen, that glue would build up and it would get lumpy, so then your surface isn't flat. And it took a while to get that old glue off there. Every so often you have to clean all that old glue off so you had a nice flat surface. Okay, let's talk about the difference between the hard pads and the soft pads. A hard pad works better if you've got something completely flat all the time, but there's so many curves and body lines and stuff now. And these here will kind of mold a little bit around. They seem like they just float over the surface better. They give you a little bit of a cushion. How many times you've been DAing on the roof of a car or a hood of a car and it'll start vibrating, the sheet metal starts vibrating and your DA will start dancing around? Usually that's a little bit too hard of a pad. You won't have that trouble with the finish sander on a panel like that. One thing is they run a little bit smoother and they don't vibrate like the DA does. Let's take a look at the pattern that these things sand into the finish. I took the door and I sprayed quite a bit of guide coat on here. I'm gonna put 80 grit in the DA, sand off some, then I'll take that same 80 grit, put it on a finish sander. I think that'll cut through the guide coat and it should show up the pattern in a primer. Okay, I don't know how good it's going to show up, but one thing with the DA, when you first start out, it's almost like it's in grinder mode. You can see these long scratches that run through here before it starts oscillating. A few over there. Now we get over here to the finish sander. It's just got this nice little pattern. It's real similar to the DA, but you don't have any of the grinding effect to it, and it just runs a lot smoother. Just running my hand over the two of them, the finish sander side seems a little bit smoother than the DA side. I can see a little difference in the pattern from one side to the other. I don't know if it's showing up on camera or not. Okay, I'm gonna show you how I block sand with the DA. Your handle sits back off from the motor, and you wanna use this to guide it. You wanna use the handle and keep floating it. You can put your hand on a little bit to keep some of the vibration down, but you don't want to put any pressure one way or another. You just want to keep it floating over. I'm going to go over this whole panel using the DA, and I've got 220 grit on here, and I'll show you how I block with it, and then I'll take the finish sander and do the same thing. Okay, I'm going to use the finish sander next, and this doesn't have the extended handle on it, and here you want to just put your hand right on top, push the trigger down, and keep floating over it. And you can probably hear how it does run a lot smoother than the DA. That's how I run a DA and a finish sander. And I'm kind of surprised at this primer. It's really tough. It really doesn't want to sand. This door I've used in quite a few of my videos, and I primed it up the other day, and I used this SEM high build primer surfacer. Yeah, it doesn't sand easy at all. That's why you're not seeing it powder up. I'm kind of surprised in how tough it is. You get the idea how you have to handle both of these sanders to get them to work correctly. Okay, here's my final thoughts on these two sanders. This one here is more aggressive than a finish sander. My rule of thumb is this gets used on everything before it gets primed. After it's primed, I only use this. But that's how I break down the uses for both of these sanders. I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.